the way this started we'll go ahead and jump right in. Several years ago, I would host these events about once a quarter in person, and I called it the District 5 Leadership Forum, which District 5 is my district. And they would be just a way to get people together to talk about different topics. We've had them on education, economic development. And obviously with COVID, we haven't had any in person this year, but Zoom presents an opportunity for more people to participate and also to have speakers who don't physically have to be in Brunswick County.
Right.
Our speakers today, Andy, you're in Huntersville right now, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Andy Taylor, you're in Raleigh.
Yeah, well, technically Apex, but I'm in
Apex.
Wake County. Yeah.
And Paul, where are you at the moment?
North Raleigh.
North Raleigh. I wasn't sure if you were there or Caldwell County. So.
Well, I actually relocated here 4 years ago. Just didn't tell anybody for privacy purposes.
I can
I
understand
guess that's
that.
over with now.
I can understand that. So we've got speakers that don't have to physically be in Brunswick County, which to me opens up a lot of opportunities for folks to participate in this. And we've also got people who signed up just to listen in that live all over the state as well. But today's topic is one that's just very timely, which is what the heck happened about a week ago on Election Day. Our three panelists are Andy Yates with Greener and Hook, Paul Shumaker with Capital Communications, who has literally been running statewide campaigns longer than I've been involved, because he actually interviewed me for a job when I was first getting involved in 1996 on a governor's race. And Dr. Andy Taylor is a professor of political science at the greatest land grant university in the world, NC State, and was in the Raleigh JCs with me many years ago. So I've known all three of these gentlemen a long time. And we'll start by letting them just introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their background and just a Cliff Notes overview of their thoughts on the election. And I guess we'll go with academia before we go with business on this one, to start with Dr. Andy Taylor.
I'll apologize to Andy and Paul ahead of time if I steal some of their thunder, although I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for us to get into the weeds if I do that, and they can find some novel things to say, I'm sure. Yeah, my name's Andy Taylor. As Frank said, I'm Professor of Political Science at NC State. I've been at State for 25 years now, which has enabled me to learn a lot about North Carolina politics, continue to be fascinated by it, continue to love to call the state my home. Very proud to be at NC State. I generally do work on national governmental institutions, so a lot of my research and publication is in Congress and the presidency. But as I said, I do a lot of stuff on North Carolina politics as well. I write a monthly column for the Carolina Journal as well, which I try to make about North Carolina politics as much as I possibly can, but it's not always the case. Basic takeaways from last week. I think two obvious points. One is that North Carolina is a pretty purple place, particularly in statewide offices. We saw the president win the state, and I don't think we've formally been called, but which, by the way, I think is ridiculous. I don't really understand why North Carolina has been called, but with a reduced margin of victory compared to 2016. It's about 3 percentage points. Then it's going to be about 1 percentage point this time. We had obviously a very close Senate race, which we talk a little bit more about in detail, I'm sure, later on. And just about all the council state races were very close, with the possible exception of the governor's race, which was still closer than the polls were suggesting it was going to be. And the statewide judicial races were very close, particularly the Chief Justice Supreme Court race, which is going to be really, really interesting to see how that pans out as some more votes come in. So we're going to continue to be purple. US Senate races and presidential race, as far as I can tell, in 2022 and 2024. Well, we won't have a Senate race then, but we'll have a Senate presidential race in 2024. We're going to be the target of the national parties, and there's going to be a heck of a lot of money being directed to North Carolina for those races. And then I would just sort of say stability or stasis. It's really interesting how few jurisdictions in North Carolina switched. So I mentioned, obviously, the state was won by the president again. There were only 3 counties out of the whole 100 counties that flipped between 16 and 20. They all went to Biden, That was Nash County, Scotland, and New Hanover. Most importantly, New Hanover, of course, the largest of those 3 counties, which I thought was really interesting. Obviously, little turnover on the council state, although Republicans would be happy to pick up the 3 open seats, and relatively little turnover in the General Assembly. In fact, the only real important turnover was in our U.S. House delegation, which where Deborah Ross and Kathy Manning won the 2nd and 6th districts, respectively. But they really only won those because of the redistricting that was forced upon the state. So I'll leave it at there, and I'll let Andy and Paul go.
We'll go with Paul next.
Sure. Thank you, Frank, and appreciate the opportunity. Paul Shumaker, 36-year veteran in North Carolina politics. Cut my teeth on Jim Martin's first race for governor. Set out my own shingle in 1992. I guess notable things is I restructured the way that legislative races were done whenever we took in legislative majorities in 1994 into the state house as far as state legislative races. No one really focused on them till then. The models I implemented were the models that Democrats adopted and are still models being used today. I've won 5 out of the last 6 U.S. Senate races, all 5 that I've done. Richard Burr, 3 of Richard Burr's, 2 of Tom Tillis, has been Tom Tillis's consultant since he got in politics, as well as Richard Burr since 1994. Done a few 100,000 interviews with voters in North Carolina over the years. Sort of known as the data guy, first person to introduce micro-targeting into North Carolina politics in 2004. It was being done at a national level presidential race. First person to bring in probability modeling and data analytics into the state in the 2014 Tillis race, which is basically the foundation we run all of our campaigns off of today. There's 2 types of races, and let me just hit on a couple of points here about 2020. There's 2 types of campaigns in modern day politics. In fact, well, I try to tell everybody there's a generational change in operations every 4 years in American politics on the business side of what Andy and I do. And they're completely executed totally different. The TV ads, the radio ads, the things that you see out there, that's the macro campaign. What's written in the newspapers is a macro campaign. Because of our data analytics today, we have a micro campaign, which I do not talk about in a lot of great detail with. I've tried to explain to reporters that the micro side of the world, I can tell you that where there's a narrative that the polling was wrong in 2020, I'm the guy that telling you that the narrative was not wrong in the polling in 2020. It was the way the polling was interpreted matching up to the actual voter participation. Our data analytics models, we knew where we needed to be coming out of early voting, and the weekend before the election, we were going in from the Tillis world very confident on that outcome. With that said, there is, in looking at the performance, we underperformed in 2020. There was not a issue problem for Republicans. There was a personality problem, which came out of the White House. That's one of the reasons why our down ballot candidates did much better. We have a severe gap with white suburban college educated women that if Republicans do not fix, they will find themselves losing legislative districts in 2020, in the 2022 elections for the very simple reason the legislature is going to become more urban once you see the census data that takes place. And the fact, and Andrew, what you mentioned about the president on Nash County, that's a bleed over county into Wake County, and the amount of people that are working here. And I see Nash as a foreshadowing of challenges that Republicans are going to have. I call these suburban-based voters the ping pong voters. Their loyalty to a particular party is as deep as their loyalty to a candidate. They do not have one. They chose not to be a member of either of the 2 parties. And one of the big takeaways that came out of 2016 going into 2020, 4 years ago, if we were doing this, I would be telling you that I expected unaffiliated to surpass Democrats in this state by the presidential year 2024. Actually, with the election of Trump, the fast erosion of moderate to conservative Democrats out of the party has led to an increased influx of unaffiliated. Unaffiliated will surpass Democrats by the end of the first quarter 2021, next year. That's the trend line for them at this point in time. which basically means that we're going to have we're going to have new maps for Congress, we're going to have new maps for state legislature, drawn by one side that is the smallest of the three largest voting groups. And with the urbanization, we're only going to see North Carolina become more and more competitive and stay purple for quite some time. With that, Andy, I'll kick it over to you, and then Frank will take your questions and move through this how you want to do it.
Sure. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Frank, for having me. Always good to be on with friends in Brunswick County. Again, I'm Andy Yates with the firm Greener and Hook. Also have a digital advertising firm we launched this year, RepublicanAds.com. I've worked in Republican politics in North Carolina since 2002, been active in politics in the state since 1996. Have been fortunate to do quite a bit of work with Paul over the last couple cycles, which is always fun and enjoyable. I started out doing every campaign job imaginable, moved into the general consulting world, strategic consulting world about a decade ago. Have worked in that environment on statewide races, a lot of state legislative races, as Paul has, as well as some congressional races around the state. Did everything in that world, moving more into primarily digital now. That's been the transition in my business. So I've seen an opportunity there, as Paul talked about, with the micro campaigning to really be able to move small groups in certain directions with digital, really be able to drill down and target and do some very unique things. Worked with Frank a lot in the digital world this cycle on some races he was involved in and on some different projects. And that's going to be a continued big focus of mine. And that's do a lot of work out of state in that realm. So do a lot of general consulting in North Carolina, but did some work this cycle all over the country, places like California, Oregon, Wyoming, Upper Midwest, Florida, Georgia, you name it. We were in a number of states, probably over half the country with digital advertising. And actually, one of the neat things we got to do was did some digital ads in the 39th and 48th congressional districts in California, which were the first, I think they've officially called them yet, but will be the first two districts that Republicans have flipped in California since 1998. So pretty happy about that. And then here in North Carolina, our big claim to fame was doing Catherine Truitt, the superintendent of public instruction race, and then a number of down ballot state legislative type folks. I think Paul and Andy have hit on a lot of things that happened here in North Carolina. One of the things that I found very interesting was talking with someone about that this morning, is they both pointed out North Carolina is a very purple state if you look at it statewide. But if you actually start drilling down and looking at the state, there's not a lot of purple areas actually in North Carolina. There's a whole lot of red and a whole lot of blue that ends up purple statewide, but there's not a lot, there's not a lot of competitive counties anymore. There's not a lot of competitive state legislative districts. Some of that's result of redistricting, but some of that is, where the Democrat voters are packed into your urban areas, Republicans are everywhere else. We're starting to see that change in some of your, some of your suburban counties. Paul mentioned Nash County is one where people are watching, where there might be some changes. Cabarrus, I think, is another one. The Democrats invested a lot of money there this time. Weren't able to flip either state house race, but that's an area they're going to keep coming back to. Those are going to be counties to watch. I mean, even Brunswick is New Hanover and other places bleeding to Brunswick County is going to be a county to keep an eye on. It's a deep red county now, which is funny because 20 years ago it was a blue county. And now, 10 years from now, it could very well be a purple county as fast as it's growing. I think, that's the thing to watch, is these suburban counties and where they line up. But it's very interesting to me that while we're a purple state, there's very little purple territory. And it was a very, status quo election in North Carolina. As Andy pointed out, the only two races really outside of judicial that seats changed hands were the two congressional seats. Big seats were the two congressional seats that went Democrat because of redistricting. We picked up 4 seats in the state house. Several of those were seats that I would argue we probably shouldn't have lost 2 years ago. 2 of them were seats that we probably won because college students weren't there. In the Watauga, Ashe County district, I think it's House District 93, and then the Far West district that Western North Carolina is in. Those very well may have been won by the lack of college students who weren't present because of COVID. State Senate, we lost 2 seats because of redistricting. looks like we're going to pick the seat back up in New Hanover County we lost last time, but really a lot of status quo. North Carolina voted for divided government again, Democrat governor and Republican legislature without a supermajority. We didn't accomplish a lot the last 2 years in North Carolina because the Republican legislature, Democrat governor butted heads instead of working together. But it appears that the voters statewide kind of like that arrangement. Just like on the federal level where they voted for divided government. That's what they voted for here in North Carolina. I think it's interesting looking down the tickets. I think one of the things that's gotten lost, even though the races were close, is everybody's focus on the presidential mess, is the fact that it was a really good year for Republicans. A surprising good year for Republicans, if you believe the national pundits, both nationally and in North Carolina. We're going to win every judicial race if Justice Newby holds on. We held on to all of our canceled state races, including the 3 open seats, increased majorities in the legislature, won every congressional seat we could have won, including 2 that were supposed to be really close. It didn't end up being that close in the 8th and the 11th district. So it was a good year up and down the ballot for Republicans. It was very close, a good year, and it's going to get more and more competitive, as Paul said. You see more growth in these urban areas, and that's spreading out into some of the neighboring suburban counties. But I think that's something that gets lost in all the hubbub over the presidential race, is how well Republicans did up and down the ballot, with the exception of the governor's race. And that's a race where I think there were some unique qualities to that race in terms of candidates and campaign messaging that just made that a difficult nut to crack for Republicans. And North Carolina has a history of voting Republican at the federal level, and for president and Senate, and voting Democrat for governor that came back this time. I think it's probably for different reasons than what we've seen in the past. I think a lot of it more has to do with the individual campaigns there, because we won a lot of other races down ballot that we haven't traditionally won until 2016. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens in these suburban counties. They're going to determine the future of North Carolina, as well as if some of the gains that we made nationally with Hispanic community and African American community end up happening here in North Carolina. They're going to happen for Republicans as demographics of the state change, for us to be able to remain in control. And then, of course, we get to have redistricting fun again this year, which we seem to have in North Carolina every year.
Well, for everyone who's listening, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can put it in the chat window, or there's a Q&A feature. One question, I'm going to combine a couple of questions and then let you guys tackle them. One is, obviously, the polls leading up to the election, numerous polls showed Joe Biden and Cal Cunningham leading in North Carolina. Neither one of them led where it really counted on election day. And if you have any thoughts on that, and Paul, you touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to hear more thoughts on that. And then secondly, I hear a lot of people say there's no way that the voters voted for President Trump, Senator Tillis, but then turned around and voted for Roy Cooper. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and also North Carolina's history of splitting its tickets. And whoever wants to go first.
Okay, won't you let me jump in here real quick, and just from the polling side of it in the world that we live in, and just to answer your last question is that North Carolina is a world of ticket splitters, and Roy Cooper overperformed with Republican voters. They were there, and I'm sure that Andy Taylor, being in Apex and Cary, had a lot of Republicans over there that were voting for Roy Cooper. I've seen that. In fact, I can just say real quickly, in the old 17th Senate district, majority of Republicans actually were opposed to the constitutional amendment on defining marriage between one man and one woman. They're a different animal, these urban-based Republicans, than Republicans outside of that. So with that said, real quickly, let's talk about public polling and everything else. First of all, most of your polls were modeling the black vote at 21-22%. Black vote was down 3.5% early voting. It was down at 19.5%. In fact, the ECU poll, which was modeling at less than 20%, was one that had the races the closest from that standpoint. Actually, I think black vote's probably going to end up being about 18% overall when all things are said and done, or about 18.5. So that is a 5 to 5.5 point ballot adjustment right there within the race. And we talk about margin of errors. There's margin of errors of all surveys. The fallacious assumption is that a survey is representative of the people who are actually voting. And quite frankly, in the polling world, if you go out there and try to create a model and adjust that model without using screeners and everything else, you run into a huge probability of sampling error that would throw your data completely off. So I've said this many, many times, is that if reporters knew how to read polls, they would be pollsters. They wouldn't be reporters, because it pays a hell of a whole lot better. So I always say it's really the narrative that comes in out of the polling side of that. Both sides have a tremendous amount of data analytics that comes into play. The other thing that came out of the polling narrative is that there is a silent, understated Trump vote, but you have to look for that within that narrative. The unaffiliated voters were the highest group of undecided voters in any of the public surveys that were done. They averaged anywhere from 10 to 15% on the Senate race, and also about 10 on, a little bit less on the presidential. However, if you looked at the undecideds and you looked at those who refused to answer the ballot test questions and looked at where they stood on the other issues, they were leaning Republican. Our pollster in the Tillis race, Glenn Bolger, actually told me on the Friday before Election Day, he said unaffiliated will break for Trump and will break for Tillis, for the simple reason he went and took and analyzed all the undecideds over the time series, and their issue set was our issue set. And so that's how that world went. Cooper overperformed because of the virus and the way he handled it. And those swing voters and Republicans who saw the virus as a healthcare issue were more likely to vote for Roy Cooper. Those that saw it as an economic issue were more likely to vote for Dan Forrest. And so that's, to me, that's where it is. I'm a guy that does a lot of polling. I'm a guy that did not discount the polls. I'm a guy that used the polls as a tool to help better shape the race, and was using the public polling to tell the senator over the weekend, look, we're in the hunt, that we're probably going to end up on the north side of this thing. Worst case scenario for us is dead even, but it looks like it's a +1, +2. And then let me end, say I've said this going back 10 years ago, and North Carolina is a state, in fact, Tillis and Burr both would tell you, but Tillis, in December 2012, I told Tom Tillis, run for U.S. Senate, you will win or lose midterm elections at 50 to 75,000 votes either way. In a presidential election style year, North Carolina is a 75 to 100,000 vote either way. We overperform, candidates overperform due to circumstances, but that's the political structure and makeup of this state, and that's how close our margins are.
I have one question. Since you're the polling czar, I hear people who say, well, the polling industry is done. Maybe give a 30-second description of the difference between the public polls that keep getting released to the media and the ones that you use to actually make your campaign decisions.
Yeah, real quickly. So, 20 years ago, we averaged a 65% phone match with the North Carolina voter file. Today, we average a 90+% phone match. It's actually easier to reach voters. Our polling that we do in the U.S., for instance, in a race like Tillis, we have 50% unique cell phone interviews. These are people that when we contact them, these are people who have no landline, they're unique cell phones. We contact them if they're driving and they're willing to do the survey. We actually schedule a time and call them back when they can do the survey. It is a process that takes 4 to 5 days, not a process that's done in 1 to 2 days. It's also a process that costs around $60,000 to $75,000 per survey, whereas your media survey price points are going to be more in the range of $7,500 to $10,000. That's the quality of the data, the difference there. We're making $1 million decisions on our polls. Newspapers are out there trying to sell ads off of their polls. Big difference.
Frank,
yeah,
just on the polling, and obviously I'm not in a position to correct Paul. I just add something that I think is interesting. You did touch on it a little bit. This idea of trying to poll Trump supporters. There's some interesting question as to whether that is a phenomenon or not. If it is, it's a result of one of two plausible reasons. One is this shy Trump voter phenomenon that came up in 2016, that this idea that for reasons of social desirability, people who are going to vote for Trump don't want to tell pollsters that. But there is also another theory, and I don't know whether Paul would be able to talk about this, and that is that Trump voters don't even want to talk to pollsters at all because they see them as a sort of part of the establishment media. So the way we would pass that out is having perhaps a lot of people are being undecided or saying they're going to vote for Biden when they were going to vote for Trump, but filling in the survey or responding to the pollster, as opposed to sort of basically ignoring them, hanging up, or not replying. So I guess political scientists will probably test those two hypotheses, but I think it's an interesting point.
Let me comment, because you're right about that. But here's one thing that is in the marketplace of campaign that's not in the marketplace of the media. I made a comment about data analytics. We actually model out the whole North Carolina voter file. This is something that even the Trump voters cannot ignore, the amount of data that is collected from them based upon Google. If they're online, we're collecting data on. Google's collecting data, it's put into the marketplace. If you have a Food Line MVP card, if you have a Dick's Sporting Goods card, if you're a member of the NRA, if you have a Visa card, your purchasing habits, all those things are modeled out. And so, for instance, in 2016, in the 2016 race, whereas the polls were showing Trump down, whatever else, our data models, we had scored out the data models of the voters, and it's based upon behavior, based upon past voting. This cycle, for instance, there was a group of what we call disengaged voters. These were people that were scored out through data, not through a survey, but through data, through lifestyle data, through lifestyle habits that you purchase. We used to, 20 years ago, we averaged 7 to 10 data points per voter. Today, we can average up to 6,000 to 8,000 data points per voter. And so that is the world that the campaigns will operate in. We spend more money on data analytics than we actually do on polling. I'll just give you the price points on the polling side of this. And so, like in 2016, the voters who were not scored out into the data on the probability models, and we were not able to score them, that is who we're actually going out there doing surveys for and collecting and getting information on them, so we could better score our data sets. Our data sets are more of a guide for us. Our polls are a windmill direction, which you got to interpret. But data is a roadmap for victory. It's not a poll anymore. A poll is sort of shows you which way the wind's blowing. The data tells you the operational structures you need to employ in order to get to 50% plus one. That gets into all the micro campaigns. And to give you an example, whereas in Tom Tillis's race, we probably did 10 or 12 TV ads. I did 115 unique digital video ads into the micro universe. 115, never seen by a reporter. If you're not in my data universe, I may have 35,000 voters on one issue I want to communicate with, and I am targeting them by going to groups like Andy Yates. In fact, Andy's one of the vendors we use in a lot of the stuff to build a universe to go in there and just have a conversation with those 30,000 people, those 30,000 voters. That's the world that top level campaigns function and operate in today.
Andy, you want to chime in?
I would just echo that point that Paul made on the data modeling. Real life example to me is I heard from a bunch of Republicans, we never saw any ads from Truett. What'd you do? We never saw any ads. We never saw any. I had another consultant call me and say, we never saw any ads. And I said, great. You're not the kind of people I want to message to. I want to, especially with these down ballot races where your budgets are low, you want your ads going to that 5-7% that's true swing voters in North Carolina. I mean, we've got a lot of swing voters. We've got a lot of ticket splitters in this state, but it's actually a small percentage of the vote. I mean, a large chunk of your vote in North Carolina is baked in by what jersey you're wearing, whether you're wearing that red jersey or that blue jersey. And a lot of those folks, they just need a turnout message. But there's a lot of, you got the ability now with all the data we have, the modeling we do. Paul gives me some great stuff to work with on that front. We've got the ability on the digital side to drill down and just hammer those folks very precisely and go after those people and try to move those numbers at the margins on those people who are true swing voters, on those people who make up their mind the last week of the election. And that's, there's a lot of those folks out there. And, I would echo Paul's point that on the polling side that the analysis is wrong. I read a great article earlier this week that argued it wasn't so much the polling industry is broken, it's that the people that are doing the election analysis industry that's broken. The people that are looking at these polls don't know how to read them. They don't understand margin of error. They don't look at the samples to see if the sample actually makes sense or if it's a joke. And, I looked at some polls this cycle. I won't call any names out on this call, but some polls that I immediately dismissed because you could look at their sample and tell it was completely off. Some others I put great credence in and ended up being very close because you could look at the sample and tell that they knew what they were doing. And the private polling is, is so much better than the public polling. And I had a pollster years ago. I asked why the public polls were so bad a year when there wasn't even a lot of talk about it. And his comment to me was simple. He said, the pollsters who are really good do private polling because it pays a lot better. The pollsters who aren't that good do the public polling because it doesn't pay as well. And that's just, that's what Paul said. What the public pollsters are willing to pay for is a whole lot different than what we're willing to pay for on the private side. So you're getting a whole lot less information. And there's also, frankly, some folks on that side who are polling to shape the story as opposed to tell you what's actually going on. And we all know that's what's happening, and they're releasing everything out there. I mean, everybody wants to talk about the 17-point poll in Wisconsin that ABC Washington Post put out that had Biden winning Wisconsin by 17 points. I don't know anybody other than the folks at ABC Washington Post who published that poll who thought it was real. But they're not screening that stuff. When we as consultants see a poll that's not real, we start asking questions and we start going, maybe this isn't real. And we're not going to base decisions off something that looks flawed, whereas the media jumps all over it and makes a story out of it because they're looking for clickbait, not looking to make accurate decisions to try to win an election.
And just by way of an analogy to tie into something you and Paul both said, Paul mentioned that if reporters could read polls, they'd be pollsters, not reporters, because it pays better. Kind of reminds me of as a county commissioner when we get a well-meaning reporter who's 6 weeks out of journalism school who tries to interview us for 30 seconds and then write an article on something that's very complex, like a water system issue or a tax issue. They have no ability to understand, and then we have to go correct their story. I think that, it's the same concept where they just simply don't understand what they're trying to communicate, and then their editor gives them a clickbait headline.
Well, and part of the problem, especially at the state level, is that the political reporter is going the way of the dinosaur. And you got the same person trying to write about the U.S. Senate race that was writing about the county commissioner meeting the night before, that also has got to write the story that night about the robbery at the Circle K. And their knowledge.
And the cat stuck in a tree.
Yeah, the knowledge of this stuff is not there when we had political reporters at every decent paper in the state who were doing this full time, who built relationships with folks like Paul and Andy and myself, who had all day to study this and dig in. And not necessarily the reporter's fault, it's just the way that industry's going. But and that's true in every state, and you're ending up with a lot of bad political reporting, not necessarily because they want it to be bad, they just don't understand what they're reporting. They as Paul said, they don't know how to read the poll, and they don't have the experience covering politics to have a feel of whether what they're being handed is good or bad.
Hey Frank, let me add one thing to this to try to put it in perspective. And don't want to dominate the discussion, but I'm going to use the North Carolina judicial races for an example to understand the difference between polling the data and how the world goes. And that is, and I've done a lot of judicial races, but in the survey research, going back 3 election cycles, if you asked all things being equal, you prefer Republican or Democrat on the Supreme Court, you would find a 2 to 3 point advantage for Democrats. If you ask that same group of people 4 or 5 questions later, all things being equal, you prefer a liberal or conservative on the Supreme Court, you would find a plus 12, plus 13 point advantage for the conservatives. With that knowledge, I did a baseline survey. I had NCGOP with Chairman Watley. We put together a judicial victory fund on the state account so we can coordinate 100% with the state party. And I went and had our data team that's doing the data for TELUS because we're going to be outspent. We had limited money, a lot of dollars in the marketplace. I had that data team. I estimated that universe based upon the polling was going to be somewhere between 300, 450,000. He actually came in right at about 425,000. We used a data model and identified 425,000 voters in North Carolina who did not say prefer a Republican, but who preferred a conservative. And then we had them broken down into a Trump voter. And so they got Trump unique messaging on mail and digital. We had them broken down to law and order on the protest. They got mail unique to that. And then we had what I call a pure swing voter, some more suburban based. And what they would get was mailing that was like the official North Carolina conservative judge's guide. It looked like it was from the government. It did not look like it was from a campaign. And we made for the first time sweep every judicial race. and I don't know, other than Newbie did a little bit of TV in the outside areas, but the candidates had access to that data model. The state party ran a program targeting that into that data model. And so in the Republican cases on all these judicial races, we ran purely off of data and nothing off of traditional campaign models that related to radio, TV, and all the other stuff. But that's how polling is integrated into. That's how we use polling as a tool to help us to enhance where we go out and build our data models to actually run the campaign based off of a data model, not off of a polling model.
Well, we do have one question. Let me scroll back up here. This is from Mr. Neil Moore in Gaston County, and I'm going to read it word for word. This is Neil's question, not mine. Why did the Forrest campaign spend their TV money so early? They were non-existent in the last 3 weeks. So who wants to jump on that?
Well, I'm not close to the campaign, but there was perhaps felt a need to kind of close a gap that they thought was pretty large. If they read the polls at face value, which as Andy and Paul have suggested, wasn't a good idea, and I'm sure Forrest's campaign was privy to a lot of that information, but nevertheless, he was lagging, and I think he needed to grab hold of anything he could early on to try to make it a race. If there had been money in the back pocket for the last 3 weeks, I don't know whether it would have made a difference. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the data to know whether Neil, I have the same impression as Neil, but I'm not sure if it's totally true from the data. It was just, they were always playing catch up. You've got to try to get yourself into a race. I think he made a calculated gamble to be pretty visible and vocal on the lockdown issue. I actually think that helped Forrest a little bit. I think he probably in another year would have actually maybe even lost by more. I think there were a lot of Democrats, or a lot of, especially, well, maybe more unaffiliated voters, possibly even some potential Republican Cooper voters who saw in the governor not necessarily the bad policy making, but bad policy making process. Who felt that Cooper was a somewhat overly cautious, often contradicting himself, muffled, unclear in the policies that he was taking. But obviously, it wasn't enough for Forrest.
I'll just real quickly, and Andy's right, but what Forrest can, and I did not advise Forrest, but if he was not he would not be able to raise the money to close a race unless it was a race. So by spending money early, he's trying to make it a race and to hope that it happened. One thing that just took place this cycle is that the presidential and the senatorial took all the oxygen out of the room for almost all the other candidates. I use Cooper as an example. Here's a guy who spent $30 million on TV, and I cannot recall a single one of his TV ads. I mean, we had a U.S. Senate race over $300 million was spent, presidential race over $200 million. That was Forrest did better than he should, quite frankly, given the environment. Republicans didn't do as good as they possibly could have. And that was because white suburban college educated women who we won in 2016, we lost by almost 2-1 in 2020. And it wasn't about the presidential or the U.S. Senate. In all of our data, when I looked at the subsets going down to the other races, it was the same number for everybody. Didn't matter if you were Trump, Tillis, Forrest, didn't matter if you were a judicial candidate, did not matter if you're a state legislative candidate. We're on average was getting about 33-34% of that vote. And what's scary to guys like me in the business is when you keep seeing the same number over and over and over on all these races with the same demographic crosstab, that is a structural inherent problem that has to be addressed. And it's a reflection of who we are or how they perceive us.
Next question is from my friend Johnny Carswell from Burke County, and I sense at least some level of sarcasm in this question. What do you have to do to become governor in North Carolina?
Well, if you got the money, you start with hiring me and Andy.
Step one, acquire $50 million.
Either raise a lot of money or have the ability to write a check with a lot of zeros on the end of it. That's
But-
where it
Well,
starts.
but
Well-
to be sensible, being, possibly being attorney general is a good way to do it, right? I mean, that route to the governorship seems to be a fairly popular one the last few times. Obviously, Bev Perdue and Pat McCrory are exceptions to that, but you don't get there quickly. I mean, I think the interesting thing, perhaps a lesson here for Forrest, is yes, he's been lieutenant governor, but he came from nowhere to be lieutenant governor, which wasn't the case, for example, with Bev Perdue. You need the state, in terms of picking gubernatorial governors, and maybe even gubernatorial candidates in both parties to a certain extent. Thinking back to Richard Vinroot, particularly, who seemed to be the perennial Republican gubernatorial candidate for a while, we're pretty conservative. I mean, we're not, you don't see sort of Trump types or Sanders types coming from nowhere, running against the North Carolina political establishment and catapulting themselves into the governor's mansion. I mean, there does seem to be a sort of significantly long apprenticeship for successful gubernatorial candidates for people who end up being governor. I don't know how to explain that, but that would be I guess that would be my advice if you look into history, is if you want to be governor, you're going to need a 24-year plan or something along those lines.
I think to piggyback on that, I think timing is everything as well. I mean, you see that with Roy Cooper. There were people that wanted Cooper to run in 2008, for example. He would wisely realize the timing wasn't right, that Bev Perdue was going to be the nominee. People wanted Cooper to run in 2012 when Perdue bowed out. He realized that the cake was baked for Pat McCrory in 2012 with Bev Perdue's unpopularity, as well as the timing of when she got out of the race. He didn't make a race of it then. He was rumored at times to be a U.S. Senate, to be being recruited for U.S. Senate, passed on all that. He picked the right year to run in 2016. I mean, you can ask Pat McCrory about timing. He ran in 2008 and got caught up ran as good a campaign in 8 as he ran in 12. He got caught up in the Obama wave in North Carolina in 08. And in 12, the time was right. Purdue had bombed, and the time was right for Republican governor. So, timing is part of this for everything. Part of it's ability to raise money. Part of it, I think, is that long apprenticeship. I'm curious to see if some businessman could come out of nowhere and get elected governor of North Carolina. It would be an interesting thing to watch. And it'd be, to see. I don't know who that person would be, but it would be interesting to see somebody come out of proverbial left field, either Republican or Democrat, and run that's not been a big city mayor like a Vinroot or McCrory, not been lieutenant governor, not been attorney general, and see if they can shorten that learning curve. Because North Carolina, as the other Andy said, tends to be a state that wants governors who've been in public roles forever. I mean, Pat McCrory had been mayor of Charlotte since I think I was in middle school when he ran for governor the first time. So these are folks who've been in the public eye forever, who we tend to prefer as governor. And I think people didn't feel like they knew a lot about Dan Forrest. I mean, part of that was the money disparity, but I had diehard Republicans coming up 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the election who didn't know who our Republican nominee for governor was. You couldn't name him. Ask me who it was. They were going to vote against. They were going to vote for him because they didn't like Cooper, and they were Republicans, but they just didn't have that level of knowledge or comfort with Dan Forrest. And part of that was the money disparity. Part of that was all the noise Paul talked about. And I can tell you, sitting here in Charlotte, the last 3 or 4 weeks, I kept the TV on in my office constantly to see what people run on TV. I saw more ads for Jamie Harrison than I did any candidate on the ballot in North Carolina. I could tell you more about his message than probably any North Carolina candidate's message right now. And so there's a lot of noise that got drowned out, and people just, between the short period of time he'd been on the scene, lieutenant governor being a fairly low profile position in North Carolina, and a lack of money, there was just a lack of comfort level and knowledge with Forrest. And I think some of the vote was for Cooper was, frankly, vote for the devil you know versus the devil you don't kind of thing. And I think that was part of the problem that Forrest had. People just had that comfort level with. In North Carolina, shown they want a governor they're comfortable with.
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick and just do a little bit more of a, what I call a commentary analysis on this. You can apply it to the governor's race, you can apply it to any race and everything else. First of all, you have to understand the marketplace, and the cost of running for office is not determined by the office you're running for. It's determined by the marketplace in which you've got to compete in. Currently today, the average American gets 35,000 advertising impressions a week. We're all here. We're tuned to politics. We are the exception. We are not the rule. 85% of the folks out there do not pay attention to this. And with the rise of the unaffiliated voters, they tend to discount anything that's political. They don't like political. They don't like political advertisements. You have to figure out how you can politely invade their space on something they care about to get their attention in order to connect with them. That becomes the function of money. Quite frankly, my opinion is that actually being an incumbent running, the longer your record is, the easier it is for guys like me to create a narrative that may be unfavorable towards you, or it could be favorable. What comes down to is your ability to understand marketing, your ability to have the resources to engage in the marketing place, and less about other than the experience of age for qualifications. In two cases in point, Barack Obama was a better messenger, better marketer in 2008 than Hillary Clinton was. He knew how to connect. He was a media star. He handled it. Donald Trump in 2016 was the marketing expert. It wasn't about quality. You look at Jeb Bush's resume, you look at Rubio's resume, you look at all the resumes in the world. It was purely about marketing, and you have to understand that in how you engage in that world and the importance of that world. And a problem in the gubernatorial races for North Carolina moving forward is that we are going to be such a battleground on the presidential front. We will not have a senatorial race in cycle in 2024, but we'll have another one in 2028. And so the marketplace is going to be more expensive. And to put that into perspective for you, in Charlotte media market in the very last week, a gross rating in 2010, you could buy all the media in North Carolina and your burn rate was about $360,000 to cover the whole state with 1,000 gross rating points. In 2020, the burn rate in Charlotte was $2.5 million for 1 week to have 1,000 gross rating points. That's the marketplace. And that's the place that you have to compete in, because the people who are going to determine your fate are not going to be people who take the time to pick up and go out and go to political meetings and go to events. There are people getting up in the morning, getting to work on time, getting kids dropped off at daycare on time, being able to get food developed, have food on the table that night, and maybe working a second job. They're busy in their life. And they see politics as an interruption of their routine, a necessary interruption. They don't see it as a way of life for them like a lot of us do.
Moving on to another question, and this one was submitted by Camille Ettinger. And Paul, you'll probably want to jump on this. Our friends, along with my husband and I, are Republicans, and we all have the same question regarding the polling quoted in the news. What is the population makeup of these polls? And with many people unlikely to answer an unknown caller number, how do you get a good sample group?
First of all, what you have to do is you have to spend the money to make the calls to be able to talk to enough to get a representative sample. And one of the things that I talked about, and then the cost and the price points of this, if we go through a survey, and let's say we talk to 600 people or 800 people, if that is not representative, let's say out of 800 people, it is 55% male, 45% female, we have a skewed out sample. We have to continue to make calls. That's why I said it takes 4 to 5 days to be able to complete the surveys now to have legitimate size of it. The other thing is online survey panels, which a lot of media outlets like to rely upon, everything else, are not necessarily as reliable as live interviews. So the answer to your question is that today you have to make more phone calls. You have to take much longer time, and you have to be able to weigh it out from that standpoint. To give you an example, 10 years ago, I grew up in the western part of North Carolina, grew up in Caldwell County, but the city of Hickory population of about 30,000 people. 10 years ago, it was easy to do a survey in the city of Hickory. Today, I cannot do a valid survey in the city of Hickory. For me to be able to talk to me to get a representative universe of N equals 300 out of a population of 30, I need a phone file of 60,000 phone numbers to get there. I can't get there off the residents that are there. So polling is going to be more reflective and better on congressional races and in Mecklenburg County and Wake County in statewide races, it's going to be less reliable when it comes to legislative races just because of the dynamics of the problems that you're talking about there. Now, one thing, let me just add one thing, though, we found this cycle that actually was helpful in doing that is that we actually employed, even with our data analytics, is that we took our sample size, let's say, 120,000 across North Carolina. We can now text you. We got text. That's one of the things, text messaging this cycle. We would actually text you and say, you have been randomly selected to conduct a survey for North Carolina politics and everything else, and actually had people to reply back, or you may be getting a call and using that information. One of the things that is still very true is that if people think it is a legitimate survey, they will participate. We like for our opinions to be known. If you listen in on the calls when the surveys are being done, the person being interviewed will say, is this going to be on TV? Will we see the results? Where can we see it? They get engaged into that process. So there's a lot of tools to do it, but it's a functionality of being able to afford it, to be able to have information, reliable information you're going to make decisions upon.
We're coming up on 5 o'clock, and I don't want to hold people, especially the panelists who I know are busy people, for much more than an hour. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Number one, you've talked a little bit about the changes in suburban North Carolina. We've also seen some changes in rural counties like Columbus, Bladen, Robeson, that typically have been Democratic strongholds, but have voted Republican the last few cycles. If you could touch on that a little bit, and then any other predictions you might have about what's coming up in North Carolina in 2022 and 2024. And Andy Taylor, let's start with you on that one.
Well, you're right, Frank. One of the interesting things that we saw in 2020, especially if we compare it to 2016, and we can compare, the Trump vote across the two elections, is that although there was a significant amount of stagnation or stasis, as I said, and Andy was talking about this as well, there were a number of places that actually became more red and more blue. So hence the phenomenon that Andy was saying, which is that statewide we're purple, but there aren't that many purple jurisdictions now. Whether we're talking about counties or we're talking about the state legislative districts, or even talking about congressional districts, there really aren't that many purple places. Yeah, so the rural-urban divide, which is a bit of a cliche now, but there's a lot to it, is getting deeper. I don't know what will happen, whether it will change. Of course, there are still a number of rural counties, particularly in the northeastern part of the state, and then some odd ones like Anson County in the southern part of the state, which have large African-American populations and are still pretty democratic. I think the interesting ones are those places that are a bit of both. And so ex-urban counties are going to be increasingly the battlegrounds then between Republicans and Democrats. We were talking about Nash County, which I can't remember. I think it was Andy who characterized it as a spillover from the Triangle. Now that, being a Triangle resident, that's really interesting to me that that's happening. But there are other places. Union County is a very good example of a place which is going to be increasingly important in statewide elections, because it has, a bit of everything, and it falls into this ex-urban category. So yeah, I mean, it's a continuation of that. One thing will be interesting to see what Republican strategies are. Paul mentioned the problem that Republicans have with suburban women, which are going to become an increasingly large part of the electorate in the state, and will be a problem if those numbers continue as they are, or continue to grow as Democratic advantage. Some of the minority population, particularly Latinos, I think there are plenty of opportunities for Republicans there, but they're going to grow as an important part of the electorate as well. And of course, in North Carolina, are as much rural as they are urban. So yeah, I mean, that's not really an answer to your question, but more sort of a description of where we are, and rather than an explanation, but it certainly is a fascinating topic. Yeah.
I think part of it, Frank, with the rural counties in North Carolina, I mean, the reason I think a lot of some of these rural counties were Democrats because of history. I mean, they're generational Democrat families, but they were conservative Democrats. And there was a lot of these counties also voted for people like Senator Jesse Helms for a number of years. And they saw a difference between the National Democrat Party, who they perceived as too liberal and out of touch, which is why they voted for people like Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Senator Helms. But they saw a difference between that and the North Carolina Republican Party, which is why they continue to vote Democrat, or the North Carolina Democrat Party, which is why they continue to vote Democrat at the gubernatorial level, at the state legislative level for local offices. What they're seeing now is that the North Carolina Democrat Party is the same as the National Democrat Party. North Carolina Democrat Party's moved to the left, particularly on social issues. Part that's been influenced by people that moved in out of the state, and these socially conservative, Bible Belt rural counties like a Robeson County that was the, one of the bluest of blue states for many years are now, I think Robeson County voted 58%, 59% for President Trump. Every Republican on the ticket carried Robeson County from the statewide level. They picked up a county commissioner seat, I believe, this time. They're seeing that there's the Democrat Party at the state level is very similar to the National Democrat Party level. There's not that divide. There's not North Carolina Democrats and National Democrats anymore.
Right.
I think that's a large part of what's happened there. And I thought it was interesting. Andy Taylor mentioned Anson County, which has stayed Democrat, even though Richmond County on the other side and Union County on the other side have gone Republican, largely because of the high minority population in Anson County. Even Anson County this time voted over 47% for President Trump the last time I checked. And I mean, I can remember the first race I worked in professionally was in the 8th Congressional District in 2002. And Anson County was in that district. And we would have been happy to get 35% out of Anson County. We would have been ecstatic to get 35% out of Anson County for a Republican. And now, you're talking about 47% in a county like that voting for Republican. And I think it's a lot of social issues. It's also a lot of the working class. And I think President Trump contributed to this. Feels like the Democrat Party's abandoned them. They're more interested in urban issues. They're more interested in the liberal side of social issues and things like that, as opposed to the issues that they care about. And it's an interesting, almost realignment going on with. There is a realignment, in my opinion, going on. It's very interesting.
Let me jump in here real quick. Couple things. First of all, on legislative redistricting, you're going to see state house and state senate districts in the rural areas get larger. You're going to see the urban-based districts get smaller. Same thing for the congressional races. What's going to happen in the future? One, we're going to stay competitive. I do not believe we're going to tip and go blue like Virginia did, because our economy is still predominantly driven by private sector. You look at the Wake County area, you look at the Triangle, you look at Charlotte. We're industry sector based, whereas Northern Virginia is government sector based, and there is a difference there. However, Republicans are going to have to address their education gap problem. And quite frankly, our issue set is inconsistent with that. And I'll leave you all with this thought. First of all, if we're the party about private sector development, we're a party about economic opportunity, if we're a party about entrepreneurship, guess what? To attract national average or above national average paying jobs, you have to have people who have 4 years post college degrees or postgraduate degrees. Our whole economic success and viability in the future is directly linked back to education. And so we can be in a pickle of trouble real fast if an Amazon decide to locate here and bring in 30,000 workers. And so that is really, to me, it's not the urban rural divide that is going to be the challenge for the future. That will be the public policy challenge for those who are elected. The political challenge is going to be how do Republicans develop an issue set that helps fix that education gap or as this state continues to grow, we will become non-competitive because of our failure to do so, which I like to tell my clients, if you're a free market conservative, if you believe in competition in the marketplace, then develop an issue set that allows you to be competitive in a marketplace in which you have to run in order to win elections.
Man,
Well, it is right at 5 o'clock, so I want to thank you gentlemen for taking your time to be with us this afternoon. I think this has been a great discussion. We could probably stay on here till about 9 o'clock, but I don't think any of us want to do that. The next one of these events will be on December the 10th, and it's going to be a legislative preview. I'm getting ready to post the information in the chat window for anyone who wants to go ahead and pre-register. Our panelists for that are Tom Fetzer with Fetzer Strategic Partners, Greg Thompson, the State Director of National Federation of Independent Business, who was also listening in on this call, and Amber Harris, the Director of Government Relations for the Association of County Commissioners. So that should be a good discussion about what's coming up next year when the legislature comes into session. And for those of you in southeastern North Carolina, there will be one in January, early January, which will be an economic forecast that will feature Adam Jones, professor at UNCW, talking about the local economy, and Professor Tom Simpson talking about the national economy. And he usually has some pretty interesting things to say, so he'll be worth watching as well. But thank you again to our panelists, and you guys all have a great afternoon.
thank you, Frank.
Frank.
Thank you, Frank.